Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Good to see you guys. Happy Tuesday. And today in this video, I forgot to say welcome to my room. Today in this video, I wanted to give you a little tool. Some of you may already have this tool, but it's possible that many of you do not. A little tool that will allow you to understand and navigate better differences between various models of reality, including the reality of personality, which is, what maybe interests us most here, and also being able to, figuring out which one is the one that you favor, how to compare between different models, and how to answer the frequent critique according to which MBTI is nonsense, is useless, etc. So I'm going to get a little bit technical, but stay with me because it's not that technical. It's pretty intuitive when you think about it. Maybe it's more philosophical than technical. So I want to suggest to you that truth can be interpreted in two ways. You can think of truth as absolute, incontrovertible truth that is the case and there's nothing more you can say about it. This is the truth with a capital T. And then you have relative truth. Truth that is, to speak in slightly more specific terms, truth relative to a scheme or truth relative to a theory. So we're not talking about, post-truth or, the truth, supposed alternative facts or whatever that is. We're talking specifically about the distinction between absolute truth and truth relative to a scheme. Those two concepts are coherent. Now, the fact that they're coherent doesn't mean that the reference of those concepts, namely absolute truth and relative truth, exists. It only suggests that it might not be possible to prove that they do not exist. And in fact, if you look at a little bit more, in detail, the question of absolute truth, you'll notice that actually it may exist. We do not have the tools to prove that it does not exist. But it's in many ways a little bit empty, and it's not a concept that is very easy to work with. And the reason why is because, ever since the works of people like Karl Popper and many others, including Thomas Kuhn, we know that every piece of data, piece of content that we approach and experience is approached from within, a web of theoretical relations. That is, we never approach the world without some kind of theory. You can never encounter anything in the world and interpret it without the help of something that looks like a theory. And this might seem counterintuitive to you, but it's actually, not that difficult to prove that the world does not give itself to you as true or false. One easy way to make sense of this is to keep in mind that what is true as far as we're concerned are statements, right? We never, whenever we judge something to be true or not, it's a statement. It is true that the sun will rise tomorrow. So the truth is predicated not of the sun, but of the statement that you make about it. So there's a fundamental difference here between the linguistic entity that is the statement and the physical entity that is the sun. And there's no reason at all actually why the physical entity interacts with the linguistic entity so as to give the linguistic entity absolute truth. And in fact, even for a statement that is as extreme as the sun will rise tomorrow, it actually isn't an absolute truth. It's not an absolute truth, because if it were an absolute truth, then what this would mean is that regardless of where you are in time, in the future, or in the past, that statement will be true in virtue of its absolute truth. But obviously we know that it will not always be true that the sun will rise tomorrow, and so you have your answer. As close to absolute truth as this statement seems, it is actually not absolute truth. And so what this suggests is that whenever we operate with our theories, whether they're conscious theories or theories that we unconsciously acquire that are embedded in our very use of language, we try to figure out what is true or not according to that scheme. It could be a very, very broad scheme with an immense amount of explanatory power, and it can work very well for us, and that's totally fine. And in a way, we could use this, we could talk about universal truth as a kind of shortcut for these kinds of truth that are so strong that they work for most of what we talk about. But, first of all, these truths are not that common. And we should always keep in mind that, in the last analysis, we're always talking about truth relative to a theory. Now, a consequence of this is that when you're looking at different theories, different models of, personality, for instance, you should never look at their merits in terms of how they conform to a supposed absolute truth, because as we just saw, we can't even really comprehend absolute truth. If there is such a thing, it's beyond maybe our cognitive powers to apprehend. Something that Chomsky said as well. So if you encounter a skeptic or someone who tells you, well, MBTI is nonsense because it doesn't fit reality, you're like, what does it mean to fit reality? Like, we've known for a long time that every single scientific theory, even the best scientific theory of our current day, is going to be superseded in the future by better theories. Now, if there are better theories, obviously this suggests that whatever best theory of the the physical world we have at the moment does not fit reality that well, does it? Because if it did fit reality perfectly, then we would be happy to keep it. Okay? So this, I think, is a useful observation, because it allows you to see that whenever someone comes to you and says it doesn't fit the facts, doesn't fit reality, what they're really saying is it doesn't conform to absolute truth. But then you can just point out all that I just explained to you in the first 7 or 8 minutes, and they'll have nothing left to reply. Either they don't understand what you're saying, and so you'll be talking past each other, and that's fine, or they understand and they realize that it's no argument to say that a particular theory does not fit the world, because there is no theory that you can possibly conceive that fits the world perfectly. Okay, so the question is more, how well does it fit the world, and for what purposes? And this is the question that is useful to ask when it comes to MBTI or socionics or objective personality, any other model that is proposed to determine personality. But like, I'm talking specifically like about a niche here, but you can look at a lot of different psychoanalytic theories. You can look at totally different theories of personality that have nothing to do with MBTI and its successors, and assess it for its. I think you can assess it along 3 main dimensions. First, is it coherent? Right? If there's a lot of theories that are simply not internally coherent, and you can dismiss them on that basis. Second, does it have explanatory power in terms of its axiomatic construction? Can you make predictions, and are they useful? Notice that I'm not talking about are they true or are they absolutely true. Are they true relative to the scheme? Are they true relative to the theory? And also, are they useful? Because if they were true but empty, if they're coherent but empty, then you could argue that this is not a great model. And thirdly, and this is an important an important tool, I think, for being able to compare models beyond the criterion of coherence and explanatory power and use. The third criterion is, does it have does it have purity as a discourse? Now, what do I mean by this? Purity as a discourse. Every theory has its own discourse. What you'd want to avoid is a model that might be coherent and might have good explanatory power in its own right, but mixes up the language and the discourse of another theory, maybe a competing theory, with its own. It should always specify how it's, insofar as it is a different theory, even if it uses similar vocabulary, it should be able to explain accurately and in detail how it interprets the facts differently, or how it takes a particular element of another theory and has a different interpretation of it. So, for example, if you take socionics and MBTI, you'll come across introverted feeling in both, but have a closer look, and you'll notice that they don't define it in the same way. And it's to the credit of both theories that they each have their definition, but it is not to the credit of either theory, or maybe to the theory that came after the original theory that is using the same term, because it can be very confusing. And this is how, if you have this mix-up, you could actually answer questions to a test very faithfully and get a good result, but in a language that is mixed up with another terminology, which will then inevitably give you a result which will surprise you and maybe lead you to be confused. If socionics, for example, and MBTI interprets the functions differently, then surely if you get a certain type in one, it will not mean exactly the same thing if you get the same type in the other. But at the same time, just as in the same way that it will not be easy to translate one from the other, it will just not be easy at all to give any type translation. So it's not just like if you get INFJ in one and an INFJ in the other, that means the same thing. It doesn't. But it also means, and this is very important, that if you get INFJ in one and INFP in the other, that still doesn't mean that it's the same thing, because the models cannot be completely mutually intertranslatable. Each has its explanatory power relative to the scheme, and the truth of it relative to the scheme. So keep this in mind, because a lot of the time people make the mistake of thinking that INTP in one model means exactly the same as INTP in another model, but it's not useful, and it's sort of misguided to think that way. And the models themselves are responsible for being misleading, because if both models meant the same thing, then why have two models? Why have four models? Why have five models? Apply this to maybe models that are even more recent and popular these days, and ask yourself, when it predicts this particular type for a particular person, is it plain wrong because intuition tells me it's wrong? Or am I thinking it's wrong because I'm operating with my own theory that I appropriated, for example, the Jungian theory. And so according to my own theory, they're wrong. But according to their own logic, they're not wrong. The issue is, oftentimes, they use the same letters to formalize their results. And that's very confusing, because then you can end up having disagreements about, a person's type being either INTJ or ENFP or ENTP or something. And you will have people on both sides being ready to defend their truth, with a lot of insistence. But not just insistence, a lot of points. But the points will make sense to them because they're not operating with your model. And you're not operating with their model. So, focus on what's useful, what you think is the best explanatory model. Don't waste time trying to figure out which one is the best one compared to the absolute truth of fitting to the world, because it's not intelligible to us. It may exist, may not exist, we cannot know. Okay? Well, That was a nice little discourse for you there. Hopefully not too much rambling. See you soon.